Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. I've spoken a few times in recent episodes about an old pattern of mine, saying no a bunch of times to people and to opportunities before finally getting around to saying yes. It was a fear thing, I suppose, something about not wanting to disrupt the status quo, something about not wanting to be edged out of my comfort zone, however uncomfortable that comfort zone might have been. I like to think that I've cured that tendency. At the very least, I'm now much more aware when I'm doing it, and I'm much more likely to catch myself as I'm saying no. And if I do catch myself, I'm able to initiate a course correction and change my no to a yes. If not immediately, then pretty soon after. One of the most dramatic examples of my naysaying started more than 3 decades ago. I say started because the 3 times I said no to this particular opportunity probably spanned about a year. I talked back in episode 2 about the writing workshop I took that initiated a hugely radical and revolutionary change in my life. And if that wasn't a no when it was urged on me, it sure as hell wanted it to be. To recap, I was working as a freelance magazine editor in-house when one of my staff colleagues buttonholed me one day and urged me to take a creative writing workshop that she had just taken. I guess I did say no the first time, and maybe even the second, and maybe even the third, but all that happened in the course of a single day, and by the end of that day, I had finally surrendered. You can hear the whole story of that if you go back to episode 2, where I talk about my reluctance to being a writer. But the bottom line is that it was that workshop that planted the seeds that would later blossom into a full-blown and life-changing creative and spiritual awakening. Yet as significant as that experience was, that's not the no I want to talk about today. Well, it isn't, and it kind of sort of is, because it was that workshop that would, a year or so later, lead to the dramatic no I'm about to share here today. But let's go back to that workshop for a couple of minutes. The workshop was a one-day event offered through the Continuing Studies Department of the University of Toronto. And at the end of the afternoon, Carol Lechner, the instructor, invited us to continue with her privately. Not one-on-one privately, but as a group in her living room. That was nearly 40 years ago, so I don't remember how many of us said yes. And I certainly don't remember what prompted me to say yes pretty much right away, especially when my pattern at the time would have been to say no, at least initially. But somehow, for some reason, I did say yes. And over the next year or so, I explored and deepened a creativity I didn't even know I had. Still, when the series of classes finally ended and our group disbanded, my life as a freelance writer and editor continued much as it had before. I wasn't really doing anything any more creative than I had been before, which wasn't a lot. All I was doing, still, was writing other people's stories to other people's deadlines. And when I wasn't doing that, I was editing other people's stories to other people's deadlines. And I was very good at what I did, and reasonably successful, which is saying a lot in the highly competitive market that was Toronto back then. But I can't honestly say that I was passionate about what I was doing. And I certainly wasn't tapping into my stories because I didn't believe I had any stories worth tapping into, worth telling. Nor was I being creative in any more than surface ways. So one day, sometime after the end of that series of classes, Carol called me out of the blue. "How's your writing going?" she asked. It wasn't, and I mumbled some sort of vague reply. "I'm starting a meditation class in a couple of weeks," she said. "I think you'd enjoy it. Are you interested?" Well, I didn't say no right away, and I guess you could call that an improvement of sorts, but I also didn't say yes. You see, back then, I was a very matter-of-fact kind of guy. If something couldn't be experienced with at least one of my physical senses, it did not exist and it could not exist. At least that's what my logical mind kept insisting. So why didn't I say no right away? It's a good question, and I really have no answer, except, well, maybe there was a deeper part of me trying to be heard. And although I wasn't quite ready to listen to it, to hear it, it could make sure I didn't shut the door completely on that opportunity. I told Carol I'd think about it, and I did. And I was no more spiritual or metaphysical, at least not consciously, by the time I called Carol back. But I had talked myself into viewing meditation as nothing other than a convenient relaxation tool. And I figured I could sure use some sort of relaxation technique. So I ignored the spiritual aspects of meditation, And I told Carol, yes. Now, if Carol's creative writing workshop and classes had begun to chip away at my certainty that I wasn't creative, the meditation classes carved out a chasm of Grand Canyon-like proportions in my long-held belief that if I couldn't touch it, taste it, smell it, or see it, it sure as hell couldn't exist. Carol's meditations did far more than relax me. Through them, I began to experience powerful visions, to hear powerful messages. I began to access things that I'd never known were in me, things like intuition, like inner guidance, inner knowingness. I began to remember my dreams. I began to be intrigued by my dreams. My once solid, concrete-seeming foundation of a life lived within the limitations of a logical mind, first cracked, then crumbled, then disintegrated in the brilliant light of infinite possibility, of other dimensions, realms, and realities, and of a creative potential that, despite the power of Carol's writing classes, I hadn't somehow managed to touch before. Suddenly, I was alive in ways I'd never been before. Suddenly, colors were brighter, more vivid. Experiences had more depth, more intensity, more meaning. It felt as though I had been living in a tiny, dark, windowless cell, and some explosion had shattered the walls to let in light and air, and even the floor of that cell was no longer a solid slab. It was like sand now, shifting with each footstep. Some days it was even like water, and miraculously, I was walking on it. And that was just the beginning. At the end of the series of meditation classes, Carol reached out to me again, this time suggesting that I might benefit from some private one-on-one sessions with her, a sort of blend of spiritual and creativity mentoring. This time, I didn't hesitate. This time I said yes right away. Through those months of private sessions, my spirituality deepened, and my sense of the world beyond our five senses, my sense of the metaphysical world, stretched, and stretched some more. I meditated, of course, and I wrote in ways I'd never written before. I wrote poetry. I wrote from my heart, not from my head. My work was not only creative, it was passionate. It was luminous. It was numinous. It was visual, and it was filled with imagery. You see, my writing had previously been another dark, windowless cell. Now its walls, floors, and ceiling had exploded into free-flowing, fireworks-like bursts of lyrical prose. I was finding a voice I hadn't even realized I'd lost. Now I not only remembered my dreams, I paid attention to them. I journaled them, I explored them. One very cool dream showed up when I was considering expanding my dream work by booking a session with a Jungian therapist. Now, one of the advantages of living in a city like Toronto was that there were quite a few Jungian therapists to choose from. One of the disadvantages of that time, however, was that there was no AI chatbot to scour the net and surface recommendations for me. There wasn't even a net, so no website, no Google reviews. And I knew no one to ask for recommendations. In fact, I knew no one who knew anything about Jungian therapists. So what was I to do? Ironically, it was a dream that gave me the answer. In the dream, I'm looking for a therapist for my dog, for Roxy, and I mentioned Roxy in last week's episode. In fact, Roxy was the star of last week's episode. I don't remember much about the dream, and it was a long time ago, but what I do remember is taking Roxy to a therapist's basement office. And although there was no name on the door, there were initials, the initials BB. As I interpreted the dream at the time, the basement office represented my unconscious mind, and Roxy, my dog, represented my instinctive, intuitive mind. But the most significant of all were the initials, BB, because one of the local Jungian therapists I had discovered was named Bruce Barnes. Now, Bruce's office wasn't in a basement, but in every other way he was perfect. And it was a dream about looking for a professional to help me study my dreams that found him for me. But getting back to my work with Carol. By then, Carol's one-day workshop had expanded into a 10-week course, and it had become so successful that not only was Carol teaching a section of it, she had brought in 2 other instructors to teach additional sections. And one day during one of our sessions, Carol asked if I would like to teach a section of the course. It was called Personal Creativity in Writing, or PC&W for short. Immediately I said no. Of course I said no. I had absolutely no interest in teaching, at least not consciously. Carol shrugged, and we moved on. A few months later, she asked me again. Again, without thinking or even considering it, I said no. She didn't argue or try to talk me into it. She just let it go. The same thing happened the 3rd time she asked me. And then another couple of months passed, and she asked me again. But this time, kind of like the meditation class of a few years earlier, I didn't say no. Now, I didn't say yes. I said, let me think about it. And then I had a dream. Not a dream, the dream that changed everything. I had that dream more than 30 years ago, but it's still so vivid in my mind that I could have just woken up from it. And usually I'm not in the dream, at least not directly. And the dream seems to be taking place during World War I. The two people in it are a woman, Beth, and her husband, George. At the start of the dream, they're in a Jeep. George is driving, but they hit a landmine, and Beth is injured. And in the next scene, they're in the hospital, Beth in bed, George in the chair next to her. Beth is talking about teaching, and George is trying as hard as he can to discourage her. He's saying it's too dangerous. But finally, after much discussion, much debate, much arguing, Beth sits up and declares passionately, and in a tone that brooks absolutely no argument, I must teach, she says. In that moment, the dream fades and I wake up. Now, on its own, that seems pretty clear, but there was more. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes wake up with a snatch of a song lyric playing in my head. It's kind of in that in-between state between sleep and wakefulness. And to me, those bits of song can be as powerfully eloquent pieces of direction and guidance and information as any dream. And that's what happened next. So let me tell you a bit about what I heard. First, some background. Every Saturday morning in synagogue, a Hebrew prayer is sung as the Torah scroll is held up for the congregation to see before it's returned to the ark. Now, I won't sing the prayer to you, and even if I did, most of you wouldn't understand the Hebrew. But here's how it translates. This is the law that Moses placed before the children of Israel, from the mouth of God to the hand of Moses. It's like that prayer added a giant exclamation mark at the end of Beth's declaration after she says, I must teach. Just in case I miss the significance. This is the law. It's kind of hard to ignore that. So that morning, I called Carol back and I said yes. I didn't know what it would mean to say yes. All I knew was that however scared the protective George aspect of me was, I had no choice. As the Beth part of me put it in the dream, and as it was so eloquently, dramatically emphasized, I had to teach. Period. So what was I afraid of? Why did I say no those first 3 times? Why have I had such a pattern of saying no before I can let myself say yes? You know, so often what we're most afraid of, what we're most self-conscious about, are not those places where we're least talented, least skilled, least gifted, least amazing. And they're not the places where we're weakest. More often than not, those are the places where we are most talented, most skilled, most gifted, most brilliant even. More often than not, those are the places where we're most powerful. Let me say that again. Those are the places where we're most self-conscious. Those are the places where we're most powerful. And because of that, they can also be the places that are most likely to disrupt our status quo, to change our lives, maybe even to change them so radically that we won't recognize ourselves on the other side of the experience. In the earliest days of my spiritual awakening, way back 30-something years ago, I remember identifying what to me at the time was almost a paralyzing fear. I'm afraid I won't recognize myself on the other side of all these changes I'm experiencing, I remember saying to myself, and I'm afraid no one else will recognize me either. In the end, that's exactly what happened. I'm not remotely the person I was 30-something years ago. My life is not only radically different, it has changed and changed and changed again multiple times since then. I don't recognize that person anymore. And those who knew me in the years before that spiritual and creative awakening probably wouldn't recognize me. And you know what? That's okay. That's more than okay. That's terrific. I don't have a moment's regret. My life is indescribably richer, more vibrant, more passion-filled than it was before that creative and spiritual awakening. And so what about teaching? What happened after I said yes? Well, I worked with Carol over the next few months to prepare me to teach her course. And finally, my first 10-week section of personal creativity and writing found its way into the University of Toronto's catalog. Yikes. Now it was time to prepare for my first class. And that's when I discovered what my real fear of teaching had been about. Well, at least one of my fears. So I'm sitting at my laptop, putting together notes for the first of the 10 classes. More accurately, I find myself not so much writing notes as typing a complete script of everything I'm going to say, and I mean everything. Why? Because the idea of being spontaneous in front of a group of strangers terrified me. How could I be in control in a situation like that? How could I be in control if I didn't know what the hell I was going to say from one moment to the next? I often talk about my books as being independent, sentient entities with imperatives and, yes, with minds of their own. Turns out that also applied to the PC&W course, to personal creativity and writing. Hell, it applies to every one of my creative projects, including this podcast. So the sentient entity that was personal creativity and writing back then made it painfully clear to me that if I was going to teach it, I was going to have to get past my control issue that was pushing me to write out a detailed script for my class. And the key word here is painfully. Within an hour or so of typing my detailed minute-by-minute script, my hands cramped up so badly, so painfully, I couldn't type. Only then did I get it. How could I teach a course that was all about trusting and letting go if I wasn't prepared to trust and let go in teaching it? I knew the material inside out. So all I had to do was trust that. All I had to do was get in front of that class and let the material speak through me, letting it find the exact words and phrases that would best communicate its principles and its exercises to the 13 men and women in the room. Easy in principle, not so easy in practice. But I couldn't barely type, so what choice did I have? Does that mean I was no longer terrified? I wish. You know, there are moments in our lives, however long ago those moments are or were, that are as fresh 5, 10, 20, even 30 years later as they were the moment they first occurred. Kind of like the Beth dream I shared with you a bit ago. And the evening of my first PC&W class is one of them. Not the class itself, which I barely remember, but what I do remember vividly is the 20-minute walk from my downtown apartment to the university's Larkin building. It felt like a death march. In a sense, it was. Whatever happened, failure or success, I knew I wouldn't be the same on the other side of it. I dodged the rush hour traffic on Queen's Park, crossed behind the Faculty of Law building, and paused on its rear terrace that overlooked the campus. I closed my eyes, gripped the stone balustrade, and tried to do a silent, fast-forward rehearsal of the class. Tried. Didn't quite work. Instead, I hyperventilated, and my brain shut down. All I could hear was a whole lot of noisy static in my head. I slowed my breath as much as I could, which wasn't a lot. And I found that the only way to clear my head and stop the static and stop the hyperventilating was to stop trying to anticipate the class. I slowed my breath some more and tried instead to focus on that moment of me standing overlooking the university campus in the early stages of a greening spring. And in that moment of calm, I saw a trio of encouraging faces in my mind's eye: my mother, my Gerson father, and my birth father. I tell the complicated story of my conception and birth in episode 3, and it's worth a listen if you haven't heard it yet. So I see those faces in front of me, and in that moment, all the complications and dysfunction of those relationships, and there were lots, dissolved. Instead, my mother, my Gerson father, and my birth father, all of whom had been dead for quite a few years by that point, faced me with love and unconditional support in their eyes. And in that moment, I knew that somehow, it would be okay. I would be okay. And as it turned out, it was more than okay. The students loved me and I loved them. And more than that, I loved the experience. It was exciting. It was exhilarating. It was profound. And it was enriching, at least as much for me as it was for the students. And I was hooked. My greatest fear, the thing I was most self-conscious about, turned out to be something I not only loved, but was really, really good at. Less than a year later, I left Carol and her course behind, and I was creating and teaching my own courses, my own workshops, and I've been doing it off and on ever since. In fact, I have a new 6-week writing workshop series starting up on April 5th. Now, we're all self-conscious or embarrassed about something. Usually it's more than one something. It could be our looks, it could be our voice, it could be our background, it could be our education, it could be our job, could be, as it was so often for me, our creativity. It could be our ability to speak in front of a group. That's a big one for a lot of people. So what in your life are you self-conscious or insecure about? Whatever it is, it's probably for some of the same reasons I've said no so many times, including those first 3 times when Carol asked me to teach her course. As I would put it in my book, The Book of Messages, about a decade later, those areas of your life where you feel most self-conscious and insecure are the areas of your greatest strength, greatest power. Embrace them. I'm doing my best to embrace mine by kicking my no habit and just saying yes. Not to everything, of course, but if I'm tempted to say no from fear, I do my best to move through and past my fear enough, just enough, to say yes. There's a line in my novel, The Moon Quest. I think I may even have mentioned it before in a previous episode. And it's told to Toshar, the story's young protagonist. He's about 17 and he's being urged to embark on the journey that will end the tyranny that has taken hold of the land. And of course, he's scared. I mean, who wouldn't be? Now, he isn't told not to be afraid, because you can't tell someone to not be afraid. Instead, he's told, feel your fear, then pass through it to the other side, where your destiny awaits. Feel your fear, then pass through it to the other side, where your destiny awaits. Our destiny is always waiting on the other side of a yes. Life's gifts, its magic, its miracles are also always waiting on the other side of a yes. So embrace your strengths, even the ones that scare you, especially the ones that scare you. Embrace your power, even if it scares you, even if it scares others, especially if it scares you or others. And if you're saying no like I was out of fear, feel that fear as Toshar was called to. Then pass through it to the other side where your destiny awaits. Because whatever that destiny is, it's far more wondrous than anything your conscious mind can conjure up, could ever conjure up. And if it changes you, and chances are that it will change you in amazing ways. That has certainly proven to be true for me. And I'm not all that special, so if it's true for me, it has to be equally true for you. Just say yes. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.